History.
We shall never surrender.
Politics.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony.
Current affairs.
Going to Pizza Express in Woking is an unusual thing for me to do.
Conspiracies.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
We'll stop terrorists from coming after us.
I just received a beautiful letter from Kim Jong-un.
It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons.
I'm not guilty of harassing anyone.
Well, I'm not a crook.
This is the Political Dark Side Podcast. And now, here's your host, Matthew Howland.
If you only knew the power of the dark side.
On this episode of the Political Dark Side podcast, I would like to welcome the former Liberal Democrat MP Norman Baker to discuss his investigation and book about the strange death of David Kelly. Norman, how are you, sir?
Fine, thank you very much.
Good. I see you've been on various shows lately talking about the royal family, so I imagine this might be a welcome break from that.
Well, the royal family is a story that keeps on giving, as a matter of fact. I've got this book out called "And What Do You Do?", which of course is what the Queen asks you when you meet her. And my sales agents, Harry and Meghan and Prince Andrew, are busy promoting my book for me. So it's a story that keeps on giving.
Yeah. I'd like to speak about your other book, though, the Strange Death of David Kelly. My goal here is to try and keep the story alive, as it were, and bring it to a younger audience. It actually blows my mind that there's young adults now that weren't actually alive when this was happening. I suppose that's me showing my age as well.
Yeah.
Find that quite bizarre, really. But so let's roughly set the scene in 2003. It's the immediate aftermath of 9/11. The US government's declared a war on terror. They've blamed Afghanistan in short order and subsequently invaded, with the United Kingdom in tow. The administrations of Tony Blair and George W. Bush are the best of friends, and Saddam Hussein's Iraq is the next target. The British public aren't particularly happy with 1 million people marching in February. Can you tell us a little bit about who Dr. David Kelly was and what he was doing in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq in March 2003?
David Kelly was a very, very highly respected UN weapons inspector, British citizen, who had done a great deal to expose illegal weapons and chemical weapons held by, for example, Russia in the 1990s, and indeed Iraq going some way back. So he was a highly respected international figure. He was therefore aware more than anybody else of what threat or otherwise was presented to the UK by Saddam Hussein, and his knowledge was at variance with the propaganda, that's the right word, put out by the government in advance of the of Iraq. And I use the word propaganda very advisedly because it was very clear to the British government that Iraq was not the threat which the House of Commons was told it was. There's a great deal of dodgy dossiers at the time produced by the government to try and justify the case for military action. Stories like 45 minutes from doom or whatever it was appeared on the front page of the Evening Standard, directly leaked to them by Downing Street. And yet we know, and the government at the time knew, that no such threat existed. David Kelly knew. It's worth referring to a report, a minute taken by Matthew Rycroft, the Prime Minister's private secretary at the time, in 2002, so almost a year before the Iraq invasion. And this was reporting on a meeting which had taken place between the head of MI6, Sir Diallo, and equivalent people in the US. And the memo from Sir Richard read as follows. C, that's a quaint name they used for the head of MI6, reported on his recent talks in Washington. There was a perceptible shift in attitude. Military action against Iraq was now seen as inevitable. Bush wanted to remove Saddam, the military action justified by the conjunction of terrorism WMD, but the intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy. And then it goes on to say what the Foreign Secretary Jack Straw said. He said that rather than trying to stop an illegal war, a justification had to be found for it. Quote, it seemed clear that Bush had made up his mind to take military action, even if the timing was not yet decided. but the case was thin. Saddam was not threatening his neighbours, and his WMD capability was less than that of Libya, North Korea, or Iran. We, as the British government, should work up a plan for an ultimatum for Saddam to allow back in the UN weapons inspectors. This would also help with legal justification for the use of force. So what's clear from that is that Bush had decided that he wanted to invade Iraq and get rid of Saddam Hussein. Tony Blair, as Prime Minister here, wanted to go along in tow with George W. Bush, his new best friend, and was construct a case based on nothing to persuade Parliament that a war was necessary against Iraq. David Kelly, as our weapons inspector, knew that this case was not justified, and there was a tension between David Kelly and the British government.
So it could be argued that David Kelly is the most qualified man in the Western Hemisphere to speak on Iraq's weapons capabilities. Would that be right?
Yes, it could certainly be argued he's the most qualified person in the UK to speak about weapons capabilities in Iraq by some distance. And of course, it wasn't just David Kelly who had these doubts. Hans Blix, the UN weapons inspector, highly regarded, talking about the UK government's dodgy dossiers, said that they changed question marks into exclamation marks. Khan Ross, at the UN, received detailed briefing, which was contrary to the evidence, so-called evidence put out to Parliament by the UK government. The UK government was giving Parliament a pack of lies in order to get the justification for war agreed by that Parliament. That's what happened. And David Kelly knew this. And what happened, so David Kelly then had conversations with a BBC journalist, Andrew Gilligan. That subsequently appeared in a report on the BBC at a very early time in the morning, I think 6:07 on the Today programme. And of course, then all hell broke loose.
Yeah, I mean, so from my understanding, there was two different dossiers. Would that be correct? One of them literally copied from an academic paper by one of Alistair Campbell's think tanks, and then presented as if it was hot intelligence from the security services.
I can't remember if it was copied from a think tank. I think it was copied off the internet. Somebody's university thesis was borrowed. And then the other dossier was based on a single source, which was deeply ironic because the government at the time castigated the BBC for relying on a single source, which happened to be David Kelly, but relied on a single source themselves, which happened to be completely unfounded to justify their dossier.
Yeah. I mean, nobody really believed that 45-minute claim that you mentioned that appeared on the Evening Standard. Also in the Sun, I believe it appeared. I think Jack Straw actually said to the Foreign Affairs Committee that he didn't think the 45-minute claim was significant.
Well, he said subsequently the government withdrew the 45-minute claim. When did they withdraw it? They withdrew it very quietly the day David Kelly's body was found dead.
Yeah. I mean, I think people certainly thought it was significant at the time. The media certainly did, and so did the public, given that I don't think anybody really believed the justification for the war at the time.
Some people did. I mean, the fact is that at the time, and it's difficult to remember this perhaps, but at the time, parliamentarians believed that when the Prime Minister of the day said something about a threat to the country involving chemical and weapons of mass destruction, and said that it had to be military action, that was such a serious matter that many people in Parliament believed that they had to give the Prime Minister the benefit of the doubt. That's what they believed. Now, I didn't, I'm happy to say, my Lib Dem colleagues and I, every single one of us voted against the war in Iraq, but a lot of Labour MPs voted for it, not because they were comfortable with it, but because they thought the Prime Minister wouldn't lie on such an important issue. Well, he did. And that's why we ended up with British invasion along with the Americans of Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And, that did a lot to undermine confidence in MPs, confidence in Parliament, and confidence in public institutions generally. And if you go on to the MPs' expenses later on, which I also helped to expose, by the way, later on that decade, these two events, I think, have conspired to reduce in the public's mind the trust it can put in politicians.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly say that of the Labour government. I think people gave them a lot of benefit of the doubt in that they weren't Thatcher's Conservative Party at the time, and that they came in with a bright new vision and then almost betrayed the trust of people with what they did here.
Well, I mean, the government from 1997, when Tony Blair came in, for the first three or 4 years, the first parliament in which they had a government was actually, in my view, quite a good party and quite a good government. It was quite radical. It brought in things like the minimum wage, moved to get rid of basket case of rail track, it introduced the Freedom of Information Act. The first 4 years of Labour was, in my view, quite good. But then the trouble was that Blair became under the spell of George Bush and seemed incapable of taking independent decisions. And the idea of being his best friend trumped everything else. And Tony Blair ended up believing his own press releases, which is never a thing you should do.
Yeah, I mean, there's a good quote from your book that I'd like to read out here about Tony Blair. You wrote, "So consistently craven has his approach been to the US president that one has to ask, if the White House held information on Blair so incriminating that its release would have caused his immediate resignation, in what way would the British Prime Minister have behaved differently from the way that he did?" I mean, like, are we looking at a situation here where the likes of Tony Blair and Alastair Campbell should have or should have to answer for war crimes?
I think so. Tony Blair did. He was well informed. Alastair Campbell played a role to support Tony Blair. He himself suggested amendments to strengthen the dossier. It's quite improper in itself. How dare someone who was in charge of communications for the government start interfering in the draft intelligence documents? He had no role to do that, but he did, with his mate John Scarlett over at MI6, or the Joint Intelligence Committee at the time. So, I mean, he did do that. So I think there is a case for Tony Blair to answer. The only thing I would say is that it's weighed heavily with him. He wears it on his face now all the time. He looks like a haunted man. And those events of 2003, I think, have stayed with Tony Blair. And they've also ruined his reputation. Tony Blair was in many ways a good prime minister. For example, he helped to broker the Northern process, which the present government's busy unraveling. So, Tony Blair did a lot of good things, but he will be remembered for that, and he'll be haunted by it the rest of his days.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the study of history and politics tends to be centered around war and what happens with such things. Moving on from Tony Blair, take us to the 17th of July, 2003. What's David Kelly doing? How is his mood? And how is he found dead?
David Kelly's name had been effectively leaked out to the press by the MOD, who were quite happy, it seems, for him to be put in the spotlight. Highly improperly, in my view. No sense of proper care and concern about one of their employees. And of course, he wasn't used to the spotlight now. He wasn't used to being in the middle of a huge furore of great political importance. I mean, who is, apart from potentially a very experienced politician? David Kelly wasn't one of those. So they treated him very poorly in just sort of PR, in HR terms. They treated him very poorly. Now, as a consequence of all that, he was summoned to give evidence before the Foreign Affairs Committee. That was rather a torrid time because he was torn between, I think, his duty to the government and his need to protect himself. I think at one point he said, "I accept the process that's going on." That's how he dealt with it. And of course, subsequently, when the government sought to explain what they regarded as his suicide, they linked it back to his unhappiness with that particular meeting. Well, that was only one episode. He then gave evidence to the Intelligence Committee in private, I think the day after of that week when he died, on the Wednesday, I think it was. And he was in a much happier mood then. He was clearly in a much happier mood on the morning when he disappeared the Thursday morning, because he was busy sending emails, he was contacting friends, he was getting himself ready to go back to Iraq to do more UN work. And clearly, from his point of view, the worst was over. And he was going to escape this maelstrom by going back to Iraq and leaving the country. That's what he was planning to do. So the idea that he was in any way suicidal is not borne out by his own actions and his own words in that particular week. And then, of course, on the 17th of that morning, he then disappeared.
Yeah, so, I mean, following the announcement of his death, Lord Hutton's quickly appointed to run an informal inquiry. I mean, it was a little bit quick, wasn't it, relative to the...
Well, look, I mean, Lord Hutton this is one of the most shameful episodes of shameful elements of the whole episode. Lord Hutton had only ever chaired one inquiry before into the diversion of a river in Northern Ireland, so he was hardly qualified to do this. But what we do know about Lord Hutton was that Lord Hutton was essentially a very establishment figure who tended to agree with the government of the day. That's what he did. So, you know, there's an episode of Yes Minister, the famous BBC situation comedy about Parliament and government, when the minister says to Sir Humphrey, the fictional civil servant, can we get a judge we can lean on? And Sir Humphrey says, no, that would most improper minister. The idea is to get a judge you don't have to lean on. And I think that's the case with Lord Hutton. It was a reasonably safe bet that Lord Hutton would come out with the correct answer. He had, for example, not only shown himself willing to defend the government, but also to defend right-wing figures. He was a vocal defense of General Pinochet, for example, in a court case. So Lord Hutton was a safe choice. Now, the curious thing about Lord Hutton's appointment is that Lord Hutton was appointed on a Friday morning. David Kelly's body was barely cold. Lord Hutton was in the Lords. Why was he in the Lords on a Friday, on a non-sitting day? That's very peculiar to find a member of the House of Lords in the Lords on a non-sitting Friday, but he was there. Charlie Falconer had gone to see him and asked him if he would run this inquiry. He said yes. It was cleared with whoever it had to be cleared with, and the terms of engagement were all agreed. And this was all happening within a matter of hours. The whole thing was sewn up in a matter of hours. Now, these things don't take just a matter of hours on a Friday morning to sort out. They are complicated matters you would expect to go through a proper process. But it was all done so quickly, you could almost imagine it was all set up in advance. So Lord Hutton was appointed. And of course, what that meant was in media terms that the story moved on very, very quickly from David Kelly being found on Harrowdown Hill very quickly to this inquiry that Lord Hutton was handling. And Alistair Campbell and his friends were going, yoo-hoo, over here to the press, and you'll turn their attention away from David Kelly and onto Lord Hutton's inquiry. And when Lord Hutton's inquiry took place, it was a disgrace. It was a non-statutory inquiry. Now, this is important because when a body is found and it's in its inexplicable circumstances or yet to be explained circumstances, there is a coroner's inquest. That's what happens in this country. That is what the law requires, a coroner's inquest to investigate an unexplained death. And a coroner's inquest is a proper legal process that follows particular rules. It follows rules, for example, whereby people give evidence under oath, where they're compelled to give evidence if necessary, where it takes place in public, where there are proper rules of cross-examination, and where, if you're going to reach a verdict of suicide, you have to be convinced beyond reasonable doubt. That's a legal test that applies to a coroner's court. None of that was going to apply to Lord Hutton because his inquiry was set up under an obscure procedure which bypassed a coroner. Now, this procedure was, I'm not saying the procedure was illegitimate because it wasn't. It was set up to be able to deal with multiple deaths. So if you're in a situation like Harold Shipman, who was responsible for 311 deaths, then rather than have 311 inquests, which would have been very time-consuming and repetitive, inquiry. But that was always a statutory inquiry. So the same rules and protections and legal processes applied even though all deaths have been considered together. So Lord Hutton's so-called inquiry was the only occasion when a coroner's inquest was displaced by something which only investigated one death, and the only occasion when it was replaced by something which was non-statutory rather than statutory. So what legal basis did this have? None whatsoever. It is the same legal basis as me talking to you now.
Well, hopefully, in case we say anything incriminating. The inquiry basically enforces the official narrative that Kelly is committed suicide from a pill overdose and slicing an artery. Why do you think that seems so unlikely?
Well, let's be quite clear. The inquiry, which went on for quite some time, was, as far as Lord Hutton was concerned, predominantly interested in what the BBC had done. This became an inquiry into the BBC's behaviour, not into the government's behaviour, into the BBC's behaviour for running this so-called unsourced or single-source report at 7 minutes 6 minutes a day programme. And the BBC became the people on trial not the government. And poor old David Kelly got barely a look in. David Kelly's death was barely investigated at all. In fact, Lord Hutton wrote in an obscure publication called the Inner Temple Yearbook, 2004. I'm sure you've read it. A riveting read, no doubt. This is what he wrote about the David Kelly inquiry. Quote, at the outset of my inquiry, it appeared to me that a substantial number of the basic facts of the train of events which led to the tragic death of David Kelly, Dr. Kelly, were already apparent from reports in the press and other parts of the media, who had no doubt been briefed by the government, by the way. So I resume the quote. Therefore, I thought that there would be little serious dispute as to the background facts. I thought that unnecessary time could be taken up by cross-examination on matters which are not directly relevant. So Lord Hutton, by his own confession, failed to investigate matters. And because it was a non-statutory inquiry, he failed to investigate them big time. So let's be quite clear about this. There were people who should have been called to give evidence who weren't called. The police officer in charge of the inquiry, for heaven's sake, Alan Young, was not called to give evidence. He's not even mentioned at the inquiry. Mai Pederson, who was David Kelly's best friend, and who had a great deal of useful information to give, was not called to give evidence. She would have been. She would have given evidence, and her legal representative, Mark Zaid, made it plain that she was happy to give evidence. Well, I spoke to Mai Pederson for an hour on the phone, and she had some very interesting facts to say. One of the things she said, for example, was that David Kelly had damaged his right elbow shortly beforehand and was unable, when they met for a meal, to cut into his steak. Important this, because he couldn't cut into steak with his right hand, but apparently that the method of suicide he chose, according to Lord Hutton, was to use his right hand with a knife to cut into his ulnar artery. I mean, this is just nonsense. So there was other things which Lord Hutton failed to investigate. There was conflicting reports from the police about where the body was it against a tree, was it somewhere else? What was David Kelly wearing? What wasn't he wearing? What possessions were near his body? What ones weren't there? All these were disputed in the inquiry itself by people giving conflicting evidence. We don't even know, because evidence was conflicting, how many police officers attended afterwards and how many were in plain clothes. And Lord Hutton failed to resolve any of these matters whatsoever. And he said that the fact that the people were telling him conflicting information, giving conflicting information, demonstrated, he says, that the police were telling the truth. Because had they been telling lies, they'd all come up with the same story. I mean, what a ridiculous argument that is. I mean, so this inquiry was just ridiculous. It was also, he failed to establish some basic facts. You know, there were no fingerprints on the knife that David Kelly was supposed to have used, and David Kelly wasn't wearing gloves. Lord Hutton didn't find that out. I found that out. I found it out by Freedom of Information request to Thames Valley Police. But that was not part of Lord Hutton's inquiry. And then we had information about the helicopter that was sent out on the search, allegedly, for David Kelly. Freedom of Information requests from a journalist on one of the local papers and parliamentary questions from me to the Ministry of Defence demonstrated that the version of events given to Lord Hutton's inquiry was simply wrong. And what the Freedom of Information request from the local journalist, part of the helicopter used allegedly to search for David's body, went over where David Kelly's body was subsequently found with heat-seeking equipment, and yet didn't find it. So what can we conclude? The obvious conclusion is the body wasn't there when the helicopter went over. None of this came out of Lord Hutton's inquiry. It is the most obscenely inefficient farrago of nonsense I've ever seen as a legal process.
Yeah, I mean, there's other bits and pieces that I found to be quite incredible about the whole thing. Firstly, he's got his Baha'i religion, which is prevents suicide.
Yes.
For one. For somebody whose job it is to be so thorough and tie up loose ends, it's quite strange that there's no suicide note, because he surely would have known the investigative mess that his suicide would have created. And also, if you're him and you've got, presumably you have access to biological substances in a lab, you're probably more likely to use cyanide to kill yourself, aren't you?
Look, this is not an easy way to commit suicide.
No.
David Kelly was not an idiot. He was an extremely intelligent man. And if he wanted to kill himself, I don't believe he did actually, psychologically, but even if he had wanted to kill himself, he would not have chosen this method. It's very painful. It was uncertain. It's actually quite difficult, by the way, to kill yourself by splitting your wrists. I know it's the sort of thing you see on TV dramas, but actually it's not very easy. You're supposed to. The only way. There's been a lot of people who tried to commit suicide that way and failed. Even when they cut the main artery in the wrist, and what that causes, of course, is a huge spurting of blood because the heart's still pumping the blood around. As a whole lot of blood comes out. There was no blood found, by the way, next to David Kelly's body, so none appeared to be spurting out. And yet we're told he lost a lot of blood, which is inconsistent. So even if you cut the main artery in your wrist, it's unlikely you're going to die. And that's the evidence from, for example, from prisons where prisons have tried that. David Kelly didn't even allegedly cut the main artery, cut the ulnar artery, which is a tiny matchstick thickness artery in his wrist. And the idea that he could die from loss of blood, which wasn't found on site, by the way, from cutting this tiny artery of matchstick thickness, is just incredible. And by the way, he had a blunt knife with him, which would have been A, more painful, and B, would not have made a clean cut and make it less likely that the blood would have seeped out. So I asked the national statistician, Karen Dunnell, at the time, how many people in the UK had died in 2003 from cutting the ulnar artery? You know, the answer was 1, presumably David Kelly.
Well, the response that you seem to have got about that not being possible is, oh, well, it was the pill overdose then that did it. Well,
I mean, let's do the pill overdose. Well, he's supposed to have taken 30, we were invited to believe, put it that way, that he had swallowed 29 coproximol tablets. 29 is an odd number. There was one left on his body in a little blister pack, which some explanation to what happened to 29 of them. 29 coproximol tablets. David Kelly had an aversion to swallowing tablets. So we're led to believe he cut his wrist with a blunt knife, with a hand he couldn't use to cut steak, and he swallowed 29 tablets when he hated swallowing tablets. And what did he use to wash all these tablets down? Because that wasn't very clear either. And Alex Allen, the toxicologist, said there was less than 1 tablet in his stomach. So what happened to the other 28 of them? You know, none of this has got any sense. The pathologist, Nicholas Hunt, who gave evidence, later on asked for the coroner's inquest to be re-established. So he wasn't happy either. Meanwhile, a whole lot of doctors who came together to question the verdicts have been pursuing for years this matter and said that he could not have died in the way that was described. So those professional doctors have been asking for a proper inquest, which is what I asked for.
Yeah. So on the morning before he goes for his infamous walk, he sends an email saying that there's many dark actors playing games. Who do you think those dark actors might have been? And presumably, if not suicide, do you think he could have been murdered?
Well, I don't know who the dark actors were. It could have been anybody. It could have been people at the MOD who leaked his name. It could have been people in the central government like Alistair Campbell who were busy making sure that this was not about him, but about something else. Who knows what that meant? He also indicated some time beforehand that he may be found dead in the woods. That was a phrase he used about a few months earlier. Rather prescient, he used that phrase. So, I mean, let's just go back to the afternoon. He left the house at around about lunchtime on that Thursday. His wife apparently was not worried where he was because she took no action for several hours. It's not quite clear whether his mobile phone was on or not. You would think she would not have rung it, but it was discovered to be off subsequently when it was reported turned off. Who knows? Where was he when the phone was turned off, or even where was it when the phone turned off? Because these days you can track a phone even if it's off. Why was that not brought out in the Hutton Inquiry? Why was there no evidence as to where his movements had been from based on his mobile phone? What was the last phone call he made? We don't know these things either. So he went out, in the afternoon, early afternoon. He would be expected back in a couple of hours. He didn't come back. It was then hours and hours later before any attempt was made to phone the police. Mrs. Kelly apparently on the day said she wasn't that worried. She thought he might have fallen over and broken a leg or something. So she didn't feel that he was suicidal on that day. She subsequently told the inquiry she did think that, but that wasn't what she said at the time. And then, of course, she was then not found officially until the next morning. So what happened? Well, we don't know. What I do know is that, and I've set this out very clearly in my book, is that it is inconceivable to reach a conclusion that he committed suicide. Certainly inconceivable to use that test of beyond reasonable doubt, which would have to apply in a coroner's case. That's inconceivable. What did happen is more difficult to establish because every single explanation of a different sort is only a 10% chance. There's no obvious explanation to what did happen. I was given certain information which led me to believe he'd been murdered. I don't know whether it's the case or not. The only other explanation, in my view, is the one that was put forward by Miles Goslett in his book, An Inconvenient Truth, which came out reasonably recently, in which Miles's view is that he was being interrogated by the MOD that afternoon and had a heart attack or some other medical event and died on them, as it were, in their presence. And clearly that would have been hugely embarrassing had that come out. So either way, it sort of explains why his suicide was created.
Yeah, I suppose the space that we're in, the theories and whatnot, they are created precisely because the so-called facts just simply don't add up. And that's why you end up with, there's 10% chance this thing might have happened, there's 10% chance this thing might have happened.
Yeah.
But I suppose it is up to the authorities and the government to actually clear up.
Yes, exactly. I mean, look, I've gone as far as I can go, and I spent a year investigating this. Miles Goslett, the journalist, has also similarly looked into it in great detail. The doctor looked into it in great detail. None of us believe the government's explanation is right. But the answer is not for me to find out what the ultimate solution is, although I put forward my best endeavours to find out what it might be. The answer is there needs to be a coroner's inquest. This man died 18 years ago. We're still waiting for an inquest. Now, I don't know about you, but I find that absolutely appalling in this country that we can have 18 years without an inquest for somebody who died in this situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Your book does hypothesize a few options about what might have happened. The US weapons inspector Richard Spurzel thought that the Iraqi intelligence services could have killed him. Is that theory actually plausible?
It is plausible that he was killed by Iraqis. He'd done a great deal to annoy them, as it were, by doing his job properly and exposing what they were doing. And it's possible, I suppose, that with all the kerfuffle about threatening noises from the UK and the US, that the Iraqis may have equated him with the UK position. In the same way as when some Canadian ends up in Canada, in China these days, they're arrested because the Chinese government's unhappy with Canada. It's a very convenient arrangement. So it may well be that the Iraqis identified him as someone to bump off. And indeed, the information I was given by I thought a quite reliable source was that indeed the Iraqis were responsible. Now, I suppose from the British government's point of view, if the Iraqis were responsible for his death, that would be hugely embarrassing, wouldn't it? Especially on British soil. So that would be a reason not to give out the truth.
I suppose there's two ways of looking at that. I mean, on the one hand, you could say it would almost prove that the Iraqi regime was dangerous enough to justify a war. But then equally, I think given that most of the wars that us in America fight are not done on our own soil, the public doesn't like to believe that foreign actors are capable of things on... No,
we have to look, as a comparison, look at what's been happening in the last 10 years involving the Russians here in the UK.
We're quick to blame them very...
Well, I mean, we've now got the Russians being fingered for what happened in Salisbury, very clearly by the government. But there's plenty of evidence that they were involved in disposing of people, mainly Russian citizens, has to be said, who happened to be in London over the past 10 years. And there's further evidence of the authorities turning a blind eye to that and reaching conclusions that Russians had committed suicide when clearly the evidence pointed towards them being bumped off by the Russian authorities.
Yeah, Gareth Williams in the suitcase, was that another one?
Yes, well, Gareth Williams is a clear case in point. And in fact, I've written quite a lot about Gareth Williams. There's a piece in the Mail on Sunday I wrote last year on Gareth Williams. But Gareth Williams was an MI6 operative who was found dead in his flat, very close to MI6, and he was found in a bag, a holdall. And we're invited to believe officially by the police now, not the original police investigation, by the way, because that was carried out properly, but by someone else who then took over the inquiry, conveniently, that Gareth Williams had killed himself by putting himself in the bag, despite the fact that it was almost impossible to believe how anyone could put himself in the bag and padlock it from the outside. But we're invited to believe that. So, I mean, there's been attempts over the last 10 years to turn a blind eye to assassinations in this country. So we already know that happens.
Yeah.
I mean, let me say this: one of the great sadnesses and worries that came out of the whole 2003 episode was the complete failure, or almost complete failure, of the press to look into this in any way. I mean, why should be left to me to find out there are no fingerprints in the knife? What's the media doing? That's their job to find these things out if it's not being revealed in an inquest. Why were none of the questions I asked investigated? Why were the people I found to give evidence on this not found by the media? What were they doing? I think we were let down by the media in this. The media in this country behaves in a way that it operates from the safe segment of the circle always. It doesn't want to ask difficult questions. Why was it that Jimmy Savile was allowed to carry on for decades? When people knew about Jimmy Savile, British Rail knew about Jimmy Savile in the 1980s. That's why they dropped him from their campaign, This is the Age of the Train. It's why the BBC kept him away from children in need. People knew, but nothing was done about it. It was never reported. So I just think the media came out of this very badly. And the bit that tried to do the right thing, the BBC, by reporting the David Kelly conversation with Andrew Gilligan, I mean, they got crucified for it. What was the end of the Hutton Inquiry? Nobody in the government was found to have done anything wrong. And yet the chairman and the chief executive of the BBC, Gavin Davis and Grey Dyke, had to resign, and Andrew Gilligan's career was trashed as a journalist. So the people who tried to do the right thing were all trashed, and those who behaved quite abominably, including taking this country to war on the false prospectus, all got away with it. That's a sad conclusion from 2003, I'm afraid. And by the way, David Kelly lost his life as a consequence.
What can you say about Mai Pederson, his contact with her?
I've already said some, but
yeah, a little bit.
Mai Pederson was his best friend. She was a person who worked for the American intelligence system, I think in the CIA. She was a member of the Baha'i faith and introduced David Kelly to that faith. They shared a number of postal addresses in the US. It's not clear, it doesn't really matter in a way, whether the relationship was platonic or whether it wasn't platonic. What is clear is that he felt very comfortable in her company, and she was in a very good position to be able to discuss at any inquest into his death his state of mind and his knowledge of the Iraq situation. The fact that she wasn't called, although she made it plain she was happy to be called, just underlines the inadequacy of Lord Hutton's shambolic process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as time's gone on, like you've said, the longer that time goes by, the worse that inquiry looks. Really, I mean that it's not been reopened certainly and reinvestigated. Your book veers off towards the mysterious deaths of other scientists around the same time as Kelly's, particularly those working with bioterrorism. I found the stuff about Project Coast to be really interesting. The apartheid South African government's biological weapons project.
Yes. Well, I mean, my inquiries took me down a whole number of rabbit holes, and I suppose, in a sense, some of that information could have been left out of the book, but it was actually quite interesting in its own right, and I think it was useful to be able to show people the avenues I'd gone down, even if they were discounted as part of the explanation for David Kelly's death. They were still interesting in their own right. Project Coast was interesting, and one of the most interesting conversations I had during my inquiries was with Dr. Wouter Basson from South Africa. And Wouter Basson, his role for the South African government had been revealed as part of the Truth and Reconciliation hearings set up by Nelson Mandela to enable South Africa to move seamlessly to majority rule. And what a great process that was in terms of making sure we didn't get civil war in South Africa. But as part of the hearings, Pederson revealed that he'd been engaged by the South African government to find ways of killing black people that didn't kill white people. And he experimented, if that's the right word, on various Zimbabweans in the bush. So, I mean, you know, he was quite open about all this. He was also, when I rang him up, busy engaged in the heart surgery and about to go and deal with someone. So we had about 20 minutes to phone before he had to go and save someone's life. You know, the contrast is quite extraordinary, really.
Yeah.
But anyway, he spent some time living in this country, and he knew David Kelly, and that's one of the reasons I contacted him in the first place. And he was also deeply involved in knowledge about weapons of mass destruction and the way governments behaved. And I recall particularly saying to him, because I was following this line of inquiry without necessarily believing it, is it possible, in theory, that David Kelly was killed by the state? And he said he didn't know he'd been killed by the state, but he said, all Western governments commit murder. If you don't know that, you're a fool. That were the words he used.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to only know about 1% of what MI5 or MI6 get up to at any given moment. The same in the US, I would say. Given the vast budgets, the things that we are aware that they've done, it certainly puts David Kelly within their realms of interest.
Well, we can't rule it out. I mean, you know, I happen to believe that MI5 and MI6 are necessary, and I believe by and large they stick to the rules, and I think they are, in most cases, a force for good. But I also believe they've probably been given permission to do things which we don't know about, and which is inconvenient to tell the public at large about. And I think the ability to kill people and break the law is inherent in that. And indeed, the government at the moment, the British government at the moment, is busy retrospectively, in a way, giving them permission to break the law through legislation, which is an interesting development. We also know, for example, with the US, that they spent a huge amount of time trying to kill Fidel Castro in Cuba. And they tried, I think, literally hundreds of occasions to kill him without success. So, I mean, there are a couple of surprising elements about that. One is that they tried to kill him so many times, and secondly, they failed to do so. And some of the methods you use, including cigars and stuff, it's just incredible. So we do know that these things go on.
Yeah, I mean, you'll be familiar with the Rainbow Warrior incident.
Yes.
With the French government. I mean, you said in a radio interview that conspiracy theory is a lazy way for people to dismiss alternative thoughts on questionable events. I mean, ultimately, everything can be called a conspiracy theory until it's proven true.
Well, conspiracy theories can be proven true, and at that point they get reclassified as something else. You know, in the lazy media approach, a conspiracy theory must always be wrong until it's right. Now, a whole lot of conspiracy theories are bonkers, or let's be neutral, have no evidential base for them. I'm pretty confident, for example, that Elvis Presley will not be found on the moon. You know, indeed, I'm pretty confident that, you know, we did land on the moon going back to 1969. So I think there are a number of theories out there which don't have a factual or evidential base to them. Let's put it neutrally like that. But there are plenty that do. We also know that false flag operations have taken place, which have been designed to put the blame on somebody else. You know, you go back to the fire at the Reichstag in the 1930s with the Nazis. You know, so we do know that these things occur. So not all conspiracy theories, so-called, are wrong. A great many of them are, but they need to be based simply on each and every case being examined on the facts and examined on the facts. That's all you can do. But for those who wish to discredit the case for investigating David Kelly, it's very convenient to describe me or the doctors or Miles Gossett, whoever it is, as conspiracy theorists, as if that's the end of the argument, as if that in itself, by using that term, you can then shut down the argument. How very convenient to be able to do so like that.
Yeah, we've certainly seen a lot of that happening, for better or worse, in this last year. as an aside, I mean, I find
Sorry, Matthew, just on that one point. I mean, Jack Straw, for example, when he was questioned in the Commons about British territory being used for rendition purposes, for planes landing and taking off, said that it hadn't happened, and anyone who said so was a conspiracy theorist. Well, some years later, they had to confess it had happened.
Yeah, they do tend to just throw the word around as a way to just delegitimize anybody's argument about anything, essentially.
In football terms, if you can't go for the ball, you go for the player.
Yeah. I was going to say, I find it remarkable how many important figures all seem to die strange deaths. I mean, like, for example, there's a very small circle of people who, I'll name them. You've got Robert Maxwell, Jamal Khashoggi, Dodi Al-Fayed, Princess Diana, Jeffrey Epstein. You can draw very short lines between them in terms of their social circles. And I mean, if anything it points to intelligence agency involvement, it's that sort of, like in my life, people don't die of helicopter crashes. They don't.
No.
Strange suicides. It doesn't add up, essentially.
Well, no doubt some strange deaths are just simply that, and the explanation given is a correct explanation. I mean, that will be the case. I mean, Princess Diana, for example, I don't believe that she was murdered. What I do think is likely is that the driver was that she was being followed by MI6 because she was undertaking activities that the British and Americans found uncomfortable. Her campaigning as landmines, for example, and that she was being continually monitored, not least of all for her relations with Dodi Al-Fayed. And I think probably what happened, I don't know, in that case was that there was an attempt to escape the tail, and it ended in tragedy in a tunnel. That's what I think probably happened in that case. I don't know, but I mean, that seems to be a reasonable explanation. But you have to look into each individual case and examine the facts. And unless you've got the facts before you, then any explanation is simply a hypothesis, no more than that, no more, no less.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the Kelly thing, I mean, I think for me the worst part of it was, you'd mentioned in the book there was a Mayfair arts event for the Labour Party having a fundraiser where they auctioned off a copy of the Hutton report.
Yeah.
This is essentially, the report is an inquiry or should have been an inquiry into the death of a man. Yeah. And they had it signed by Cherie Blair and Alistair Campbell. I mean, that's a completely psychopathic lack of empathy.
Lack of empathy, it was tacky, it was tawdry, it was offensive.
Mm-hmm.
It's inexcusable.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't. I couldn't comprehend that when I read that. It was like, I just don't know what to say about it. It's absolutely incredible. The
arrogance of power, I think.
Yes, absolutely. So your book came out in 2007. I mean, since then, are there any new developments, and what do you think the legacy of the whole affair is?
Well, the new developments were, I think, there were a few new developments, not very many, but Miles Goslett did a bit more work for his book. So, I mean, for example, he tracked down the dentist. We haven't mentioned the dentist's records, but after David Kelly's death became news, the dentist very conscientiously looked in her record in her files, because she didn't want a reminder about David Kelly's appointment going out to his widow that would have been insensitive. So she checked the files and found that they were missing from the cabinet. And of course, that was a matter of concern. So turned the surgery upside down to try and find them. Couldn't find them. Well, on a Monday morning, they'd reappeared in the right place. So they appeared to have been removed and returned. For example, now Miles Goslett, as part of his work, tracked down a dentist, I think. So there's been one or two developments, but nothing very much. And essentially, the story is as it is in my book. There was a statement by Dominic Grieve, the Attorney General, in 2011, I think 2010, 2011, when he said that he'd looked into the matter again and wasn't reopening it. So there was a reawakening of events of interest in about 2009, 2010. Which was partly my German debate in the House of Commons, partly the doctors becoming very vocal. And as a consequence of that, Dominic Grieve made a statement to shut the whole thing down again in 2010, 2011. But beyond that, there's not been very much, which has come out, and the matter remains unfinished business.
Yeah.
In terms of legacies, I mean, I said at the end of the book, one of the deeply depressing aspects of the whole business is that, apart from David Kelly dying, and him being a great public servant for this country and for the world, and he was trashed in his death by the government for their own purposes in a shocking way, and that the auctioning of the Hutton report is merely an extension of that behaviour, actually. So apart from that, all the people who tried to do the right thing, which I include the BBC, I include people like Andrew McKinley, the Labour MP, and so on, tried to do the right thing. They were all ravished, and they all suffered as a consequence. Those who did clearly the wrong thing all go away with it. That's the legacy, I'm afraid, of the 2003 episode.
Yeah. Are you involved in George Galloway's upcoming documentary?
Yes, I've been executive producer.
Oh, okay. When's that due out?
Well, it's finished. I mean, and I've seen it. I don't know when it's actually going to be released.
Is it terrestrial TV or Netflix?
I don't know. I think it depends on where we are in lockdown, because I had to speak to George about that.
Okay. So you mentioned the dentist there. I mean, I think for me, what I enjoyed about the book was there's lots of little tidbit stories like that, you know, like the mystery blonde going into the Ministry of Defence, the people in the boat near the woods. I mean, I would really encourage anybody, you know, get hold of a copy of this if you can. I actually had to buy it secondhand off Amazon. I assume it's not still in print, is it?
It is still in print.
Is it?
Still in print, and much to my surprise, I receive a royalty check every 6 months from it.
Oh, good.
So it's Matthew, and yeah.
Excellent. So I believe you've got 3 books.
I've got 3 books. That was the first one in 2007. The second one was my political memoir, which was 2015, which is called Against the Grain, which was a third about my time in Lewis, as it were, as a local politician, about a third my opposition activities in Parliament, which were great fun between 1997 and 2010. For example, when I got rid of Peter Mandelson through a parliamentary written question, and a third of my time in government as a minister, first at Transport and then at the dysfunctional Home Office with Theresa May. So that's my second book. And the third book, which I'm happy to say is selling very well, is called And What Do You Do? What the Royal Family Don't Want You to Know, which is now out in paperback in a revised version. Came out in paperback last October, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen you a couple of times on Sean Atwood's YouTube show and his podcasts. I would say this much: you're certainly a different character from your general MPs and politicians, because you seem to want to actually question things, not for any political gain, but just more of a doing the right thing. If that makes sense.
David Cameron called me the most annoying man in Parliament.
Yeah, I was going to introduce you as that, but I didn't want to get off on the bad foot.
No, I think it's a great accolade. One of my favourite. There's 3 things about me you said I really like. That was one of them. One, and the other 2. One came from Nick Clegg, who said that I was a cross between Gandhi and a battering ram. And what was the third one? Oh, was it some journalist in the Independent said while I was at the Home Office with Theresa May, I was the only hippie at an Iron Maiden concert.
Yeah, it doesn't add up, does it?
There we are. So yeah,
I suppose that's a good thing that you, in the sense, you've got your, you know, you're not pigeonholed by these are the political beliefs I have to have because I am in this political party or whatnot.
No. Look, I mean, I just said in my memoir, Against the Grain, I did what I thought was right. I got some things wrong, Matthew, you know, and there was some things I did I regret in terms of I wouldn't have quite done it that way. But, you know, I left Parliament with a clear conscience, and to me, that's the most important conclusion.
Absolutely. What are your upcoming plans then, other than the Galloway documentary?
Well, I'm doing, I've got a nice mixture of different bits and pieces. The best thing about being an MP was every day was different. So I've managed to keep that sort of approach to life. So I do 2.5 days a week advising the campaign for better transport. I do a whole lot of training of civil servants, how to work with ministers. I've done, I think, 8 courses this month, actually. It's been a very busy month. I write for national newspapers like the Mail on Sunday, the Guardian, the Sun, as well as transport magazines. I've been engaged to do some advice on from Matrix Chambers and Mishcon Drea on the forthcoming espionage bill coming to Parliament. What else do I do? I've just finished an expert witness statement for a court case coming up.
I listened to a couple of your songs.
Oh yeah, there's them as
from
well.
your band as well. That's a niche market, political rock and roll.
Well, I mean, the thing about that is that it works both ways, because nobody assumes that if you've been a politician, you've got any talent whatsoever musically. So that's the downside of it. The upside is to listen to it, at least first of all, because they want to find out what it sounds like. Actually, it did all right. I've done 3 albums and they've all done okay, really.
Yeah. Excellent.
So yeah, I got nice mixed working life, actually.
Yeah, keeps things interesting.
And I'm working on 3 more books in parallel.
3 more?
Yeah, I've kind of got 3 going on the go. We're at different stages, depending how I feel. I kind of move from one to the other.
What are they regarding?
One is a follow-up to Against the Grain, as it were. Can you see me? Because my picture's gone. Oh, there we are.
Yeah.
One's a follow-up to Against the Grain, but it's about it's a sort of autobiography about everything apart from politics. I've done lots of other things as well in my life, like run music shops and been a teacher and everything else. It's all about that, which I hope is written in a kind of engaging way that people will find it easy to read even if they don't know me. One is a kind of satire on the government, which I'm trying to get right, as written as a kid's story.
Okay.
So one of these stories that's supposed to exist on 2 levels, but kids will enjoy it, but also adults will see what I'm trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
And the third one is a confidential matter at the moment.
Okay, that sounds curious. Hopefully it's a new investigation into something.
It is an investigation, and it's a very controversial investigation.
Oh. Got me excited now. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. So thanks for taking the time to join me today.
You're welcome, Matthew.
Join us next time for the Political Dark Side Podcast.
It's a disaster. Whose idea was that? It's just ridiculous.
Available on iTunes, Google, and Spotify.
For more information, visit politicaldarkside.com.